I've spent 15 years patching roofs while my own life gathered dust. When a widow named Claire called about a leak ruining her attic, I pulled up to a tired farmhouse where twin 5-year-old girls, me and June, stood on the porch staring at me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. They followed me everywhere. Then June whispered, "Mama says you're the one." Me added, "She told us you'd come when the rain started again." I froze. The words hung between us like a riddle I hadn't asked. I hadn't mentioned my tin snips, hadn't said a word about that rusted toolbox riding in the passenger seat. And yet this carpenter, a man gone before I ever got the call, had somehow described me. I was just a roofing contractor, dragging through life one leak at a time, with empty evenings and a silence at home heavy enough to press on your chest. That farmhouse had a mystery in its bones, a feeling that my arrival wasn't random. And as Claire waved me toward the door, one question already had its teeth in me. Was this a strange coincidence, or had I stumbled into a story someone had already begun without me? Claire led me into the kitchen, a warm room that smelled of cinnamon and old wood, and she poured me a cup of coffee with hands that trembled slightly on the pot. The twins, me and June, sat on the floor with coloring books, but their crayons barely moved. Their eyes tracked me like I was a puzzle they already knew how to solve. Claire apologized for them in a whisper. They've been like this since David passed. He was their sun and their moon. Now they barely speak except to each other. I nodded, but I didn't tell her what they'd already said to me. I wasn't sure I believed it myself. I unloaded my gear and set up the ladder under a sky that was starting to bruise with storm clouds. The roof was worse than she'd described. Water-stained rafters, soft spots where a grown man could put his foot through if he wasn't careful. I found the exact patch David had started the week he died. A half-torn shingle, a hammer still wedged into the gap, its handle weather-beaten but the head still clean, as if someone had carefully laid it there and never come back. I stood on that ladder a long time, the wind picking up, and I felt the strangest sensation, not fear but recognition. I've been on hundreds of roofs. None of them ever felt like this one. Every nail I sink, every shingle I align that's supposed to be rote. But up there, the motion came back with a kind of muscle memory I hadn't earned. My hands moved like I'd made this repair before. I started trembling for reasons I couldn't name. When I climbed down, Claire was watching me from the porch, her arms wrapped around herself. The twins were pressed to her sides. June looked up and said, as if she were reciting a weather report, "Daddy said you'd find the hammer." I marched over, the tool in my hand. "Your husband knew the hammer was up there." Claire's face went pale. "He never told me where he left it. He just said the man who finished the roof would know." I thought it was grief talking. I put it down to a dying man's confusion. I sank onto a porch step. Why me? Why a blue truck and tin snips? I bought those snips at a flea market in Boise 17 years ago. They're not special. The truck was my dad's. At the mention of my father, one of the twins flinched. Me buried her face in her mother's skirt. June just stared at me with those unnerving calm eyes and said, "Your daddy's name was Jack." I didn't tell a soul in this town I was coming, and I never spoke my father's name. He'd been gone since I was 19, a heart attack on a job site not unlike this one, a solitary man who'd left me a toolbox, a truck, and a silence I'd been filling with shingles ever since. Claire saw the shock on my face and quickly told the girls to get their coloring books. When they ran off, she sat beside me. "David talked about you before he died. Not by name. He said a man would arrive when the rain started up again. A man wearing the same weight he carried. He said, tell him the roof isn't the only thing that needs fixing." I asked her, "What else needed fixing?" She looked at her hands. "This family. David believed we were carrying something broken from before he and I even met. He said there was a debt, a promise that went unkept, and that the man with the tin snips would settle it." She laughed a small, hollow laugh. "I didn't understand it then. I still don't. But the twins have been saying things since he died, things they have no business knowing. About strangers on the street. About old phone calls they overheard in the womb, for all I know. They're not lying. They're just a channel for something I can't explain." The rain began to pound the roof just as I'd patched the worst of it. Claire invited me to stay the night. I'd never made it back before dark and the roads were already flooding. I accepted, partly because the storm, partly because I wasn't ready to leave whatever was unfolding. That evening, after the twins were asleep, I asked Claire if David kept any letters or journals. She hesitated, then brought me a worn leather notebook from a locked kitchen drawer. He wrote in this the last 2 weeks. I haven't been able to read it. It's too raw. But if you're the one he was talking about, maybe it's for you. I opened the notebook in the dim light of the living room. The first page was a letter addressed to the man who will come. It described the roof leak, the tools he'd used, the exact blue of my truck. But then it went deeper. It spoke of my father, Jack, by name, and a summer when the two of them, boys barely 12, had made a pact sealed with a handshake and a set of tin snips they'd found in an abandoned barn. My father never told me about that summer. I'd never heard of David before this call. And yet here was his handwriting, dated just 3 days before his aneurysm, describing a boyhood memory I couldn't verify but that resonated through my bones like a bell. The notebook ended with a line that turned my blood cold. When you read this, you'll already be in the house. Trust the girls. They know because the promise I broke let something in, and the only way to mend it is to finish what Jack and I started. I looked up. Claire was crying quietly. I didn't know my husband had a secret with your father. I didn't know any of this. Outside, thunder shook the windows and the power flickered. I shut the notebook. There's something in this house, isn't there? Something that's been waiting for me. She nodded. The twins call it the Whisper Man. They say he lives in the attic and that he only talks to people who owe a debt. I asked what the debt was. She didn't answer because at that exact moment, a child's scream cut through the storm from upstairs. We both bolted toward the stairway, and I saw the attic door at the end of the hall was standing wide open, a cold draft billowing down and a small figure, one of the twins standing just inside the darkness, pointing. I saw June, her small finger aimed like an arrow into the pitch-black attic. She wasn't screaming anymore. She was perfectly still, her voice flat as old paper. "He's been waiting for you, Mr. Jack's boy." Claire snatched her away, pulling her from the doorway, but the chill that rolled down that attic ladder didn't leave. It settled in the hallway and coiled around my ankles. I told Claire to take the girls downstairs, lock the kitchen door, and not come back up until I called. She started to argue, but the look on my face must have been enough. She pressed her lips together, nodded, and dragged both twins toward the stairs. June kept her eyes on me the whole way down, and just before she disappeared, she mouthed 2 words. "Finish it." I stood alone in the hall with the attic door gaping like an open wound. I've never been a man who chases ghosts. A 15-year roofing career teaches you the world is built on nails, shingles, and gravity, nothing more. But David's notebook was in my back pocket, and the words my father never spoke were suddenly the loudest thing in the house. I grabbed a flashlight from my truck, steeled myself, and climbed the pull-down ladder into the attic. The air up there was thick with the smell of cedar and old dust. Rain hammered the roof just inches above my head. The beam of my flashlight swept across cardboard boxes, a child's old rocking horse, a sewing mannequin draped in sheets, and at the far end, a wooden workbench that looked like it hadn't been touched in 30 years. On that bench sat a small metal box, rusted at the hinges, with the initials JV scratched into the lid. Those were my father's initials, Jack Vale. My hand trembled as I opened it. Inside was a pair of tin snips. Not mine were still in the truck, but identical. Same red handles, same worn bite mark on the blade from some long-ago mistake. Underneath the snips lay a folded photograph of 2 boys, maybe 12 years old, standing beside an old barn. One was unmistakably my father, all sharp elbows and a crooked grin I'd only ever seen in one other photo my mother kept hidden in her Bible. The other boy, dark-haired and serious, had to be David. On the back of the photo in my father's handwriting was a single sentence. "The promise we made is the roof they'll live under. Don't let it rot." I sat on a dusty trunk and read those words twice. My father hadn't been a man of poetry or prophecy. He'd been a roofer, same as me, a quiet man who taught me to swing a hammer before I could write my name. And yet here he was, reaching past his own grave, telling me that this leak, this house, this moment was a contract I'd never signed but couldn't walk away from. I dug deeper into the box. Below the photo was a letter, this time addressed to me by name. Matthew, if you're reading this, then David is gone and I'm long gone too. When we were boys, we did something foolish. We thought we could bury it. We couldn't. The man we wronged, Samuel Cross, died without ever knowing the truth. His family scattered. The debt of a lie doesn't cancel itself. It grows roots. It leaks into everything. If the roof David was fixing when he died is the same one I helped his father build all those years ago, then the circle is closing. You have to find Samuel's descendants and make right what we broke. The snips are the key. They were the tool we used the night everything went wrong. I set the letter down with shaking hands. Samuel Cross, I'd never heard the name, but the weight of my father's guilt settled onto my shoulders as if he'd passed me a bucket of wet cement. And then for the first time I heard it, a whisper so close to my ear that the hair on my neck stood rigid. Not a threat, a name. Samuel. I spun around, flashlight beams slicing the darkness. Nothing, only the rain and the creaking boards. But the temperature in the attic had dropped so sharply I could see my breath. Something was here. I didn't know if it was memory or malice, but it was real enough to make the flashlight flicker. I forced myself to speak. I don't know what happened between you and my father, but I'm here. Tell me what I need to do. The whisper came again, this time from the direction of the workbench. The children know. Ask them after the rain stops. And then the presence lifted like a door slamming shut. My flashlight steadied. The attic was just an attic again. I climbed back down with the metal box under my arm, my legs unsteady. Claire met me at the bottom of the ladder, her face pale. The twins said you were talking to someone up there. I held out the photograph. Do you know this barn? She studied it, then shook her head. No, but that looks like the old Cross property out on Briar Lane, abandoned since before I was born. The name Cross hit me like a slap. Samuel Cross. I think so. There was a fire there years ago. Some say it wasn't an accident. The twins, who had crept to the kitchen doorway, spoke in unison. The man in the barn is still waiting. He says you have the snips that broke and the snips that mend. I knelt in front of them. June me is Samuel the Whisper Man. They nodded, their dark curls bouncing. He doesn't want to hurt us, me said. He's just cold and stuck. He said your daddy promised to tell the truth, but he never did. The lie made the roof leak. June added, he said if you fix the lie, the roof will stay fixed forever. A chill deeper than any attic draft ran through me. This wasn't metaphor. Whatever my father and David had done, it had fractured something not just in Samuel's life, but in the very fabric of this house. Claire began to weep. David tried to fix this roof so many times and it always leaked again. I thought he was just a stubborn man who didn't want to pay a professional. But he was trying to mend something he broke as a boy. I stood up and faced her. I need to find Samuel Cross's family. Do you know if he had any children, any living relatives? Claire thought for a moment. There's an old woman named Eliza Cross who lives in the nursing home on Walnut Street. She's Samuel's granddaughter, I think. She doesn't get visitors, barely speaks. Before I could respond, the lights in the house flickered and died. The storm had finally knocked out the power. We stood in sudden blackness, only the faint glow of my flashlight cutting through. And in that darkness I heard it again, the whisper, but now unmistakably from the kitchen, right beside the twins. Hurry. The storm isn't just weather, it's what happens when a promise rots too long. If the roof doesn't hold by morning, this house won't just leak. It will come down. A panicked cry from June. He's showing me the fire, the barn is burning. She started to sob. Me grabbed my hand and squeezed so hard her fingernails bit my skin. I realized then that the stakes were no longer metaphorical or generational. This storm, this house, these children, they were all tethered to a sin committed before I was born. If I didn't untangle it tonight, the consequences wouldn't just be spiritual, they'd be structural. I grabbed my jacket and keys. I'm going to the nursing home. Now. Claire begged me not to go out in the storm. But the wind outside shrieked and I pointed at the ceiling. That roof is patched with fresh shingles, but the leak hasn't stopped. I can hear water dripping somewhere it shouldn't be. This house is dying. I have to try. She let me go, but as I opened the front door, she pressed David's notebook into my hands. Take this. There's more. I couldn't read it, but maybe it'll help. I nodded, stepped into the raging storm, and drove through flooded roads toward Walnut Street, the tin snips on the passenger seat glinting every time lightning split the sky. I didn't know what I'd say to a woman who might not even remember her grandfather's name. But I knew one thing. The whisper man was right. The roof was just the symptom. The real leak was a lie that had been rotting for decades, and if I couldn't find the truth before dawn, the whole structure was going to crumble. The nursing home on Walnut Street was a low brick building with a single light burning in the lobby, the rest of its windows dark and slick with rain. I pounded on the glass door until a night nurse in blue scrubs shuffled into view, her expression halfway between annoyance and alarm. I held up the tin snips like a badge of office, not knowing how else to explain myself. "I need to see Eliza Cross. It's a family emergency." Her grandfather's name was Samuel. The nurse hesitated, then unlocked the door. "She hasn't spoken a complete sentence in 3 years. I doubt you'll get a word out of her tonight." She led me down a corridor that smelled of antiseptic and old flowers, past doors where the dying and the forgotten slept under thin blankets. Eliza's room was at the end of the hall. The old woman sat in a wheelchair beside a rain-streaked window, her hands folded in her lap like dried leaves. Her eyes were open but gazed at nothing. Her white hair was thin as spun sugar. I pulled up a chair, sat directly in her line of sight, and laid the tin snips on the bedside table. For a long moment, nothing. Then the old woman's pupils shifted. A tremor moved through her jaw. Her lips parted, and a voice that sounded like rust-scraping iron said, "You have Jack's hands." I leaned forward. "Jack Vale was my father. I need to know what happened the night Samuel Cross died." Eliza's head tilted, and her eyes cleared with a sudden, terrible lucidity. "You want to know the truth your father buried. It wasn't an accident. It was a fire set by two scared boys who wanted to hide a smaller sin and ended up committing a larger one." She described a summer night 60 years ago. Jack and David, 12-year-old friends, had sneaked into Samuel's barn to smoke stolen cigarettes. They brought the tin snips to cut open a bag of feed they'd pilfered. A stray match caught a pile of dry hay. The flames spread faster than they could stamp out. They heard Samuel's voice inside the barn. He'd been sleeping in a stall after fighting with his wife, but instead of helping him, they ran. They shut the barn door behind them and threw the snips into a ditch before anyone saw them. Samuel burned alive, and his body was found the next morning, curled in a corner. The town called it a tragic accident. The Cross family sank into poverty and disgrace, branded as the unlucky ones whose barn had burned down because Samuel was a drunk who fell asleep with a lantern. Only two boys knew the truth, and they swore a pact never to speak of it. I sat back, my lungs emptied of air. My father and David murdered him. Eliza's eyes glittered with old pain. They murdered his name, too. Without the insurance money, denied because of the rumor that Samuel himself caused the fire, my grandmother lost the farm. She died in a county poorhouse. I grew up in foster homes, never knowing if I was cursed or just unlucky. And your father, Jack, he built a life on this land you say you work. He built it on silence. A wave of nausea rolled through me. This was why the roof had never held. Not because of a carpenter's error or a material flaw, but because the whole structure was erected on a lie that festered in the ground itself. I asked her if anyone else knew. Eliza's expression shifted from sorrow to fear. "My grandson knows, Elias Cross." She spoke the name like a curse. "He found a letter my mother wrote before she died, a confession she'd heard from Samuel's widow, and he's been waiting ever since. He believes the only way to balance the scales is to make the Vale and Morris families feel exactly what Samuel felt: loss, fire, silence. He's the one who's been keeping the roof leaking all these years. Every time David fixed it, Elias undid the work at night. He wanted the house to rot from the top down, slow and humiliating, the way our family rotted." I remembered Claire telling me David had become obsessed with the roof, refixing the same section over and over, never able to understand why the patch wouldn't hold. Now I knew. A living enemy, not a ghost alone, had been dismantling his work. "Then David's death," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Was that Elias too?" Eliza closed her eyes. "David climbed a ladder to repair a loose shingle 1 week before he died. My grandson was waiting in the shadows of the barn. He shook the ladder until David fell. The head injury caused the aneurysm 3 days later. He told me this himself, gloating in this very room. I couldn't tell anyone. He said he'd kill me if I did. But you're here now, and the storm is here, and there isn't much time left." A cold, deliberate fear climbed my spine. I grabbed her hand. What is he planning tonight? Eliza opened her eyes again and they were wet. Tonight the storm is the anniversary of Samuel's death. Elias believes that if he burns the farmhouse with Claire and the twins inside, the circle will close and Samuel's spirit can rest. He's already there. He's been waiting for someone to come, someone who would either run or try to stop him. He doesn't care which. He wants to watch the house fall. Before I could move, the door to the room swung open. A man in a heavy raincoat stood in the doorway, water pooling around his boots. He was in his 40s with a lean, hungry face and eyes the color of spent charcoal. He held a gas can in one hand. In the other, a framing hammer that looked like it had seen decades of use. "Elias Cross," I said. He smiled, a joyless baring of teeth. "You're the roofer, Jack's boy. I saw your truck at the farm. I wondered how long it would take you to trace the leak back to its source." He stepped into the room, setting the gas can on the floor. "Eliza, been telling tales again. It won't matter. By dawn, the Morris house will be cinders and you'll have a choice. Try to rescue them and die, or stand here and live with the guilt the way your father did." I rose slowly, forcing calm into my voice. "You killed David." He nodded, no hesitation. "I merely finished what the two cowards started. David should have died in that barn 60 years ago alongside Samuel. Instead, he got to marry, have children, live a full life while our family collected ashes. He got extra decades he didn't deserve. I just collected the debt." He rapped the hammer against the doorframe. "And now his widow and those creepy little girls are going to feel what my great-grandfather felt, trapped, terrified, and swallowed by fire. The roof you patched tonight won't save them. I've already soaked the lower beams in the basement with kerosene. When the lightning hits, and it will hit, the whole place will go up like kindling." My heart hammered against my ribs. This wasn't a ghost story anymore. It was a hostage situation with arson as the weapon. I thought of Claire's trembling hands pouring coffee, me and June whispering their warnings, and the cold draft in the attic where David's hammer still rested. "If I let you do this," I said, "you're no better than my father. You're just another man who thinks silence fixes things." Elia's eyes flickered with something unreadable. "I'm not trying to fix things, I'm trying to end them. The cycle stops tonight." He gestured toward the window. In the distance, across the flooded fields, I could just make out the faint silhouette of the farmhouse against the churning sky. Even as I watched, a flicker of orange light bloomed in a downstairs window, not yet a fire, but the pilot light of something terrible about to ignite. He'd already started the process. I lunged for the door, but he swung the hammer in a wide arc, forcing me back. "You'll never make it in time if you fight me, but go ahead, try. I'll have 2 bodies to bury instead of 3. He stepped aside, a mocking invitation. "Run, roofer. Run while you still have a chance to find them alive, because the storm is peaking and the lightning isn't waiting." I grabbed the tin snips from the table, my father, now mine, and didn't look back. I sprinted down the hallway, the nurse shouting after me, and burst into the rain. My truck's engine turned over with a roar. I could see the orange glow intensifying half a mile away, and my phone buzzed with a message from Claire. "The twins say a man came into the basement. He locked the doors and now we smell smoke. Matthew, where are you?" I floored the accelerator, tires sliding on mud, and aimed the truck straight at the dark road that could lead either to rescue or to a funeral pyre. Behind me, in the wing mirror, Elias stood in the nursing home doorway, watching, the hammer hanging loose at his side. He didn't need to chase me. He knew the fire was faster. The truck skidded into the farmyard just as the first real flames licked through a downstairs window, a bright orange tongue that curled up the siding and blackened the wood. I didn't bother killing the engine. I left the door swinging open, grabbed a crowbar from the truck bed, and ran through the mud toward the front porch. The heat hit me before I touched the steps, a wall of it that pressed against my face and made my eyes water. I could hear the twins screaming from somewhere deep inside, and Claire's voice, raw and desperate, shouting my name. The front door was locked from the outside, a heavy chain and padlock wrapped around the handles Elias work. I swung the crowbar. The chain held. I swung again and again, the metal screaming, until the lock finally snapped and the door burst inward. Smoke rolled out in a black wave. I dropped to my knees, pulling my shirt over my mouth, and crawled through the living room. Furniture was already catching. the curtains alive with fire, and the ceiling above me groaned like a living thing in pain. I found them in the kitchen, huddled in the corner behind an overturned table. Claire had wrapped the twins in wet towels, but all three of them were coughing so hard their bodies shook. Me's eyes were wide with absolute terror. June was eerily calm, her small hand pointing toward the back door. "He's in the basement still. He's waiting for the floor to fall." I didn't stop to ask how she knew. I grabbed Claire and pulled her toward the back door while lifting me with my other arm. "Go through the garden and don't stop until you reach the barn. The wind is blowing the fire away from it. You'll be safe there." Claire tried to argue, but I shoved her toward the door and she ran, both twins clutched to her side. I should have followed. Every instinct told me to flee. But the basement door stood open, a square of deeper darkness in a room already engulfed in flickering orange light. I knew Elias was down there. I knew he was waiting. And I knew, with a certainty that had nothing to do with bravery and everything to do with the weight of my father's sins, that the only way to end this was to face him. I descended the basement stairs. The air was hotter here, heavy with the stench of kerosene. Elias stood in the center of the concrete floor, the gas can empty at his feet, the framing hammer still in his hand. Around him, the support beams were wrapped in burning rags, the flames crawling upward toward the joists. He looked at me with calm, almost serene satisfaction. "You came back. I didn't think you would. Your father ran. David ran. I expected you to do the same." I held up the tin snips. "This is what started it, a pair of snips and a lie. I'm not running. And I'm not letting you burn this family to settle a debt that was never theirs to pay." Elias laughed, a hollow sound swallowed by the crackling beams. "You think that tool means anything? Samuel died because your father was a coward. My whole family died in pieces after that. Poverty, shame, institutional care, suicide. I'm the last one left. And I'm going to make sure that just before this floor collapses, you understand what it felt like to be Samuel, trapped, terrified, and completely alone." He lunged at me with the hammer. I ducked sideways and the blow caught a burning beam, showering us both in sparks. I tackled him, driving my shoulder into his chest, and we crashed onto the concrete. The hammer skittered out of his hand and into a puddle of kerosene that ignited a moment later with a soft whoosh. A wall of flame rose between us and the stairs. We were trapped. Elias scrambled to his feet, his coat smoldering, his face twisted with a rage that had been marinating for 6 decades. "You want to tell the truth, Roofer? Fine. Who's going to hear it now? Who's going to believe a dead man and a dead woman and the children of the liars who built this town on a grave?" I got up, my own clothes steaming from the heat, the tin snips still in my grip. "They won't have to believe me. They'll have to believe you." He blinked, thrown. "What?" I told him what I'd realized on the drive over, hurtling through the storm with David's notebook open on the passenger seat. In the final pages, behind a flap of leather I had missed earlier, was a confession. A full, signed witness confession that David had written in his last days, admitting everything. He had gone to a notary, a man named Gerald Haskins who lived 3 farms over, and had the document notarized 2 days before he died. He'd intended to give it to the Cross family, to the authorities, to whoever would listen. But the aneurysm took him first, and Elias had never known. I pulled the notebook from my back pocket. It was damp with sweat and rain, but intact, and I threw it across the flame barrier onto the floor at his feet. "Read it. David didn't die silent. He wrote the truth. He wrote your grandfather's name and the word murder. He wrote that my father begged him to keep quiet, and he finally refused. That's why your ladder shove didn't just kill a coward. It killed a man who was 2 days away from clearing Samuel's name." Elias stared at the notebook as if it were a snake. He knelt, the fire reflecting in his wide eyes, and opened it. I saw his lips move as he read. His hand began to shake. For a long moment the only sound was the roaring fire above us. Then he looked up and all the righteous fury had drained out of his face, replaced by a hollow, childlike bewilderment. "He wrote it, all of it. Your father, the night of the fire, the pact, everything." He looked at his own hands. "I killed him. I killed him for nothing." The floor above gave a terrible groan. A joist cracked like a gunshot. I grabbed Elias by the collar and hauled him toward the basement's small ground-level window. It was narrow, the glass already broken from the heat. "We're not dying in here, not you, not me. If you want to make things right, you'll live and you'll tell this town what you did and why. That's the only way Samuel finally rests. Not more fire, the truth. He didn't resist. I shoved him through the window first, then clawed my way out after him, my shoulders scraping raw against the frame. We lay in the mud outside, gasping for breath, as the farmhouse behind us began to collapse. The roof I had patched that afternoon buckled inward with a shriek of twisting metal and shattering timber. The flames rose 30 feet into the storm, and for a moment the whole yard was lit like noon. I watched the attic window cave in, the very spot where I'd found my father's box, and I felt a curious lightness. Not relief, not yet, but the sensation of a pressure that had been building for decades, finally releasing. Fire trucks arrived too late to save the house, but early enough to contain the blaze. Claire and the twins were found in the barn, wrapped in horse blankets, alive and unburned. As the first light of dawn broke through the receding storm clouds, I sat on the tailgate of my truck, the tin snips beside me, David's notebook, now slightly charred, cradled in my lap. Elias was in handcuffs nearby, being led to a sheriff's cruiser. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at anyone. But as they put him in the backseat, I saw him press his forehead against the window and close his eyes, like a man who had finally stopped fighting a weight too heavy to carry. The sun came up and the remaining smoke from the ruined house rose in a thin gray column against a pale pink sky. Claire walked over, the twins holding her hands. June stopped in front of me and placed her tiny palm flat against my scarred, soot-streaked cheek. "The Whisper Man's gone now," she said. "He said thank you. He said he can rest because someone finally told the truth about his name." Me nodded with solemn agreement. "He said the roof will hold from now on. He promised." I looked past them at the charred skeleton of the farmhouse. There was no roof left, but I understood. The roof she meant wasn't shingles and tar. It was the shelter over this family, the lineage of shame that had been leaking into every generation. The truth, spoken and recorded and faced, had finally patched it. 1 week later, at a town hall meeting packed with every resident of Wheatland, the county sheriff read David's confession aloud. An investigation was opened into Samuel Cross's death. A memorial stone was placed on the old Cross property with the words, "Truth delayed is not truth denied." Elias confessed to David's murder and to the arson, and he was taken to a state facility. But before he went, he asked to see me. In a small interrogation room, he slid a folded piece of paper across the table. It was a letter to Eliza, his grandmother, asking for forgiveness. He asked me to read it to her. I did. And when I finished, Eliza, who hadn't spoken a full sentence in 3 years, looked at me with clear eyes and said, "It's over now. All of it is over." The final surprising detail came a month later when I was helping Claire and the twins settle into a small rental on the edge of town. I was cleaning out what remained of my truck's glove compartment when I found a business card I didn't recognize. It was for a cabinetry shop in Boise. The address faded. On the back, in my father's handwriting, was a single line: "If you ever need to know where the truth is, find the barn." I'd never seen that card before. I hadn't put it there. And yet somehow I knew exactly which barn he meant. It was the same one from the photograph, the same one Samuel Cross died in. The barn where 2 boys had made the worst mistake of their lives and sworn an oath of silence. The barn that, I would later learn, still stood on an overgrown lot 3 miles from the farmhouse, waiting for someone to tear it down or let it stand as a monument to the cost of a lie. I drove out there the next Sunday and found the old snips my father had thrown into the ditch 60 years ago, rusted beyond use, half buried in the earth. I left them where they lay. The debt was paid. The only tool I needed now was the knowledge that some roofs can only be fixed by the truth that lives under them. I drove away from the old Cross property with mud on my boots and a strange quiet in my chest. The farmhouse was gone, reduced to ash and timber, but the family that lived there was still standing. Claire and the twins moved into a small cottage on the edge of town, a place with a sturdy roof and no whispers in the attic. I still stop by when I'm passing through, and every time, the girls run to the door like they've been expecting me. They don't talk about the Whisper Man anymore. They talk about school and the new puppy and the tomatoes growing in the garden. Normal things. the things children should talk about. But I think about that house. I think about David's notebook and my father's secret and a pair of tin snips rusting in a ditch. I think about how easily a lie can become a foundation, and how long a foundation can hold before the cracks start to show. We spend so much of our lives building things: homes, families, reputations. And sometimes, without realizing it, we build them right on top of a wrong we've chosen to bury. The roof might hold for a season. It might hold for a decade. But eventually, the rain finds a way in. What happened in that house wasn't a haunting in the way most people imagine. There were no chains rattling in the hallways, no specters floating through walls. There was just a truth that had been denied for so long that it curdled into something toxic. It poisoned the ground, it poisoned the memories, and it nearly poisoned an innocent family who had no idea what their ancestors had done. The twins weren't mediums or psychics. They were just children whose sensitivity made them a channel for a story that refused to be silenced. That's the thing about the truth. It will find a voice, even if it has to borrow one from a 5-year-old girl. I'm still a roofer. I still patch leaks and replace shingles and climb ladders under a hot sun. But I look at every job a little differently now. I wonder what's underneath the rot. I wonder what invisible weight a house is carrying. And I've learned that the best repairs aren't always the ones you make with a hammer. Sometimes the only way to stop a leak is to admit where the water is really coming from. That's the story of how I came to fix a widow's roof and ended up mending something that had been broken for 60 years. It's not the kind of story I expected to live. I'm just a contractor with a toolbox and a blue truck. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that every house has a history and every history has a door. Sometimes you're the one who's meant to open it. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening. If this story meant something to you, I'd appreciate it if you'd subscribe. There are more stories where this one came from, and I think you'll want to hear them. I'll see you in the next one. Take care of your roof and take care of the truth that holds it up.